Right, so the title of this one is a bit of a lie, and I want to get that out of the way before we start. Breaking Bad is a show where almost nobody has clean hands. The word deserved ends up doing an enormous amount of heavy lifting. Because for every person who genuinely had it coming, there's someone standing 3 feet away who absolutely didn't and who dies anyway. That gap is sort of the whole point of the show, so that's what tonight is. A slow walk through the body count, roughly in order, from a burning RV in the desert to a compound full of neo-Nazis at the very end. Some of these people earned it, some of them didn't, and I'll say so when we get there, because you can't really measure one without the other. There's no big reveal coming. Nothing builds. You can drift off at any point and you won't miss anything, which is genuinely the idea. If you enjoy this sort of thing, a subscribe helps more than you'd think. That's the only time I'll mention it. Anyway, let's start in the desert. The image I always come back to is Walter White standing in the New Mexico dirt in his underwear and a gas mask, with an RV burning behind him and a video camera in his hand. It's the first thing the show ever shows us. And what's easy to forget is that at that exact moment, Walt hasn't actually decided anything about who he is yet. He's about 6 hours into his new career, and he's already killed someone. That someone is Emilio Koyama, and he's the simplest death on this entire list. Emilio was Jesse's old partner. He'd just been picked up in a DEA bust, and Walt happened to be standing there that day on a ride-along with Hank, watching from a distance in a way he probably thought was anonymous. It wasn't. Emilio recognizes him almost immediately out in the desert, puts the pieces together, and decides Jesse has brought a cop to a drug deal. So he pulls a gun. Him and Crazy 8 both. And Walt, who is at this point a chemistry teacher with a cancer diagnosis and no plan whatsoever, does the only thing he actually knows how to do. He offers to teach them the recipe. They march him into the RV. He throws red phosphorus onto a heat source, and phosphine gas fills the space. Then he steps out, slams the door, and holds it shut. That's it. That's the whole thing. Emilio dies in there. Crazy 8, for reasons the show never really explains beyond luck and body weight, doesn't. Here's why I think this one matters, and it's a slightly odd reason. Emilio's death is the only killing in the entire series that is genuinely, boringly justified. He is holding a loaded weapon on 2 unarmed men when he dies. If Walt had somehow ended up in a courtroom over it, that's self-defense, and it's not particularly close. The show even bothers to make that legally clean, and I don't think that's an accident. I think Breaking Bad gets the easy one out of the way in the first 2 episodes on purpose, so that it never has to give you another one. Because a few hours later, in a basement across town, Walt kills the other guy, and that one is nothing like this. Fun detail I like about this stretch of the show, the gas Walt uses is the reason he collapses later with a coughing fit, and the reason Crazy 8 gets a chance to hide something. So the thing that saves his life in episode 1 directly causes the mess in episode 3. Breaking Bad does that constantly, and it never announces it. There's a small thing in the pilot I only noticed on about the 4th watch. Before any of the desert business, Walt is teaching a class, and he's writing on the board about chemistry being the study of change. Growth, decay, transformation. It's a bit on the nose, and the show knows it, because half the room isn't listening and a lad at the back is texting. Then a girl in the front row asks a question, and he actually lights up for about 4 seconds. And you get a glimpse of the teacher he presumably was 15 years earlier. And then the bell goes, and he's off to his second job at a car wash, where a student photographs him drying the wheels of his own pupil's car. He's 50, he's got a badge with his name on it at a car wash. That's the man who walks into the desert shortly after the car wash scene. One more thing about that first day, because I think it gets skipped over. Walt is only in that desert at all because of a birthday party. Hank had been showing off his service weapon in the white backyard and offered him a ride-along on a bus as a sort of jokey present, the kind of thing you offer a brother-in-law you find slightly boring. And Walt went, sat in the SUV, watched Hank kick a door in, and then looked out of the window and saw Jesse Pinkman sneaking out of the house while a naked woman threw his clothes out of the window. Oh, that's the whole origin. A man with terminal lung cancer sees a former student running away from the police and decides that's a business opportunity. So by the time Emilio pulls a gun in the desert, we're maybe a fortnight into all of this, and the show has already established the two things that will run for 5 years. Walt is much better at chemistry than anyone around him expects, and Walt will do a genuinely appalling thing and then go home and have dinner. Anyway, that brings us neatly to the man who survived the RV. Before anything else, I want to talk about the list. Walt sits down with a pen and paper like a man planning a house move and writes 2 headings. Let him live on one side, kill him on the other. Under Let Him Live, he manages a decent number of entries. It's the Christian thing to do. Judeo-Christian principles. He may listen to reason, won't be able to live with yourself, murder is wrong. Under Kill Him, there is one line. He'll kill your entire family if you let him go. And that's it. One line and it wins, and Walt knows it wins the moment he writes it down, which is why he then spends the next 30-odd minutes of the episode trying very hard not to act on it. The man in the basement is Domingo Molina. Everyone calls him Crazy 8. He's chained by the neck to a support post with a bicycle U-lock in the basement of Jesse's aunt's house. And for most of the episode, he's just a bloke down there having a conversation. That's what makes this the best hour of season 1 for me. Walt brings him sandwiches, then beer. They sit and talk. Crazy 8's dad owns Tampico Furniture over on Menal. And he did those late-night adverts, the ones you half remember at 2 a.m. Walt bought a cot there for Walt Jr. They actually worked that out together, sitting in a basement, one of them chained to a pole. And then Walt tells him about the cancer. Think about that for a second. Walter White tells a man he's planning to murder about his lung cancer before he tells his own wife. That's the first genuinely revealing thing the character ever does, and it's tucked into a scene most people remember for the plate. Which, right, the plate. Walt has a coughing fit, blacks out, drops a plate. When he comes round, he cleans it up, and later, on his way down with the key, he stops and reassembles the pieces on the counter like a jigsaw. One large triangular shard is missing. That's the whole turn. No music sting, no dramatic close-up on Walt's face. Just a man realizing he's been counting china. He goes downstairs anyway, key in hand, and asks him straight out whether the second that lock comes off, he's going to use what's in his pocket. Crazy 8 tells him to just open it, and then he goes for him. Walt pulls back on the U-lock and holds it. Crazy 8 stabs backward blindly and gets him in the leg a few times before it's over, and Walt is sobbing through all of it, apologizing to a man he's currently strangling. So did Crazy 8 deserve it? In the strict sense, yes. He was armed, he was concealing a weapon, and he had every intention of using it. He tells Walt outright that anybody in his position would promise anything, and it still feels like the worst thing Walt does in the whole first season. Both of those are true at the same time, and I don't think the show is confused about it. I think that's the design. Fun fact, and this one is genuinely lovely. The actor who plays Crazy 8 is Maximino Arciniega. 2 seasons later, the show introduces Gus Fring's murdered business partner, the one whose death sets off basically everything in the cartel storyline, and names him Max Arciniega. Same name taken from the same actor, attached to a character sitting at the exact opposite end of the moral scale. Also worth knowing, Crazy 8's car is what puts the DEA at the cook site the next morning with a little bag of Walt's product inside it, which is how Hank gets his first look at blue meth, roughly 2 days into the entire operation. There's also the disposal, which I've never quite got over. Before any of the basement stuff, there's Emilio's body, and Walt tells Jesse to dissolve it in hydrofluoric acid. Very specific instructions. Use a plastic container, a polyethylene one, because the acid will go through more or less anything else. Jesse uses his bath, and the ceiling comes down. A red slurry of what used to be a man drops through the floor of the upstairs bathroom into the hallway. and Walt stands there looking up at the hole with an expression of pure exasperation, like a man whose lodger has flooded the kitchen. That's the tone Breaking Bad found almost immediately and never lost. Something genuinely horrifying happening, and the funniest possible framing of it, and both of those being completely sincere at the same time. They flipped a coin, incidentally, to decide which of them handled which job. Jesse got the body, Walt got the man in the basement. Walt lost, and he tries to argue about it afterwards, and Jesse holds firm on the grounds that a coin flip is sacred, which is, when you think about it, the last time anything in this show is decided fairly. Now let's talk about the Salamancas, because they're going to be with us for a while. I want to start this one behind the camera because the story of how Tuco leaves the show is better than most of what he does in it. Tuco was meant to carry Season 2. That was the plan. He's set up at the end of Season 1 as the big problem, the unstable distributor with cartel connections, and everything points to him being the antagonist for a good long stretch. Then Raymond Cruz went to the writers and told them he couldn't keep doing it. He found the role emotionally exhausting, which, having watched it, I completely believe. So rather than water the character down, the show wrote him out in the second episode of the season and built an entire desert standoff around his exit. I love that. A lesser show recasts or softens the part or shuffles him off screen. Breaking Bad just goes fine, we'll kill him in 48 minutes and make it one of the best episodes we've got. So working backwards, what did Tuco actually do? He beats Jesse half to death in a warehouse over a pound of product in front of a room full of people who stand there and watch. He takes the meth and doesn't pay. Then Walt turns up, calls himself Heisenberg for the first time, and detonates a crystal of fulminated mercury that removes most of a window. And Tuco's reaction to that is to laugh and hand over the money and ask for more. That's the relationship. That's the entire business arrangement. Then there's No Dose, but I'm going to give him his own bit in a minute because he deserves it. The desert cabin is where it ends. Tuco kidnaps them both, drives them out to his Uncle Hector's place, and starts talking about taking them over the border, introducing them to his cousins, and setting them up cooking under the Salamanca name for the rest of their lives, which is presented as a generous offer. Walt tries ricin, hidden in a burrito, and it very nearly works. What stops it is Hector, sitting silently in his wheelchair in the corner, working out exactly what's happening and hammering the bell on his armrest until somebody listens. And then it's just chaos. Tuco throws Jesse through a screen door, Jesse gets dragged outside, Jesse hits Tuco with a rock and shoots him, and neither of them can finish it because a car appears on the horizon. It's Hank, of all people, who tracked Jesse's car for entirely unrelated reasons and has walked into the middle of a hostage situation without knowing it. Tuco comes limping out with a gun, and it's over in a few seconds. Small thing I always notice in that shootout. Tuco's lowrider is malfunctioning through the whole scene, hopping and juddering away in the background. It's rapid at first, then slows, then stops, right about when he does. Nobody points at it. It's just there. My honest read on Tuco is that he's the only villain on this list whose violence has no strategy behind it whatsoever, which makes him the most obviously deserving and, weirdly, the least interesting to actually think about. He's not building anything, he's not protecting anything, he's just a hazard, and hazards get removed. Two things about Raymond Cruz before we move on. The first is that when he throws Jesse through the front door of that cabin, Aaron Paul took a real concussion. Cruz didn't know. He kept going, threw him to the ground, hit him in the ribs, and interpreted Paul's genuine pleas to stop as very committed acting. That take is the one in the episode. The second is a coincidence I find delightful. Years before Breaking Bad, Cruz played a character on The X-Files called Eladio Buente. He then got cast on a show where his boss is a cartel don named Eladio Fuente. Nobody planned that. It just happened. The office scene deserves its own moment, actually. Walt walks into a first-floor room above a shop, puts a bag on the desk, and announces himself with a name nobody has heard before. Heisenberg. And Tuco laughs at him because of course he does, because there is a bald man in a hat, and glasses stood in his office demanding $50,000 for a bag of crystal. And then Walt picks up a piece of what everyone in the room assumes is product and throws it at the floor, and the window comes out of the wall. Fulminated mercury, contact explosive. He'd made it in a school lab. What I like is Tuco's reaction once his ears stop ringing. He's not frightened, he's delighted. He counts out the money, hands it over, and asks for more. Because as far as he's concerned, a man who blows up a room to open a negotiation is exactly the sort of person he wants to be in business with, which is, in fairness, the correct read on Walter White. A couple of small things I like about Tuco that aren't about the violence. He has a silver grill across his teeth, and it becomes weirdly important later. Long after his death, Hank keeps it, and there's a moment in the prequel where it's used as a sort of relic, this piece of a dead nephew that the old man hangs on to. A prop that started as a bit of costume shorthand for a flashy street dealer ends up being the closest thing that family has to a photograph. He also gets quite a lot more room in the prequel, and it's a strange experience watching it after this. He's slightly younger, slightly cleaner, still absolutely terrifying, but he's got a best friend in Nacho Varga, and a grandmother he's polite to, and a place in a family that has expectations of him. The prequel doesn't soften him, which I respect. It just shows you the shape of the world he came out of. And there's a nice bit of continuity most people miss. In the cabin episode, Hank mentions in passing that Tuco is suspected of knifing a man back in 2003. 7 years later, the prequel actually shows you that afternoon in an episode set in exactly that year, with Hector being told his nephew has stabbed someone in prison. That's a throwaway line in one show being cashed in by a different show most of a decade later. Right, since we're on the subject, let's talk about the two men who died purely for standing near him. There's a junkyard scene early in season 2 that I think about more than almost anything else in the first half of the show. Tuco is doing a handover with Walt and Jesse. It's tense, but it's business. And then one of his own men, No-Doz, finishes a sentence for him. That's it. That's the offense. He tries to smooth over a moment of tension by saying the thing Tuco was about to say. And Tuco beats him to death with his hands while the other three stand there. Walt and Jesse spend the drive home in complete silence. And Jesse says the line about how they're dead men, and he's not being dramatic. He's read the room correctly for once. Then there's Gonzo. Gonzo is Tuco's cousin, one of the closest people to him in the world. He's the one who goes back to the junkyard at night to move No-Doz's body because somebody has to, and a stack of cars shifts and pins him underneath. He bleeds out alone in the dark at 3 a.m, cleaning up after a murder he didn't want any part of. And I find that genuinely sad in a way the show doesn't push at all. There's no music, no reaction shot from anyone who cares. He's just gone, and the only consequence is that Tuco assumes he's turned informant, which is the actual point of these two, and the reason I wanted to give them their own bit. The argument for Tuco having it coming isn't really the beatings or the kidnapping or any of the stuff aimed at people he considered enemies. It's this. It's what he did to the men on his own side for nothing in front of witnesses. Anyone can be dangerous to their rivals. Tuco was dangerous to the people standing behind him. And there's a nice bit of mechanical irony in it too. The DEA find No-Doz's body. They find Tuco's bloody prints all over it, and that's what triggers the raid on his headquarters and the manhunt. He's not caught because of the drugs. He's caught because he lost his temper at a bloke who was trying to help him. There's a detail in the junkyard scene I only clocked recently. When Tuco is beating No-Doz, one of the other men actually starts to move just slightly and then doesn't. You can see him decide. And that decision is presumably the reason he's still breathing at the end of the scene. Everyone who worked for Tuco was running that calculation permanently, all day, every day. Which is not a business, really. It's a weather system with a temper. One more thing about that whole stretch since we're here. The reason Walt and Jesse are in that cabin at all is that Tuco had come to collect them, and the plan he was so excited about was permanent, not a job, relocation. He talks about it like he's offering them a place in the family, and neither of them has any way of saying no to it. And that gap between how he sees the offer and how they see it is genuinely the most frightening thing about him. There's a version of the show where that works, and they end up cooking in Mexico for 4 seasons. I'm quite glad we didn't get it. Anyway, let's leave the Salamancas alone for a bit and go somewhere much less glamorous. The thing that gets me about this episode is the light. Jesse walks up to a house in the middle of the afternoon, and the windows are taped over with bin bags and cardboard, so the inside is this permanent brown twilight. He peers through a gap. There's a sofa, some rubbish, a telly on with nobody watching it. And the whole sequence is shot like a horror film right up until you realize there's nothing supernatural in there at all. It's just a house where 2 people live. Spooge and his girlfriend had robbed Skinny Pete at knife point, taken his product and his money, and Walt had made it very clear that Jesse needed to go and be frightening about it. Jesse, who has never once in his life been frightening on purpose, goes anyway. What he finds is a small boy sitting in the middle of all of it, filthy, quiet, not asking anyone for anything. And then the parents come home, and the episode becomes about an ATM. They'd stolen it, ripped a cash machine straight out of a convenience store and driven it home in the back of a car. Spooge explains this to Jesse with real pride and calls it a victimless crime because the money is insured and it all comes out of the banks anyway. And while he's saying that, the camera quietly walks us back through the theft. The wrecked shop, the blood on the floor, the clerk they killed on the way out. The show does not comment on it, it just shows you and moves on, and I think that's one of the best 15 seconds in the 2nd season. Then it's hours of him trying to get the thing open, a sledgehammer, prying at the seams, eventually crawling underneath it with a drill because he's decided the base is the weak point. He apparently had a track record of stealing these machines, no track record whatsoever of opening one. And he spends that entire time verbally kicking his girlfriend over and over, calling her the same word until it stops being an insult and starts being a rhythm. She asks him to stop. He does it more. She asks again, then she pushes the machine upright. I've heard people call that death satisfying, and I don't think it is. Quite. It's not justice. It's physics. Nobody plans it. Nobody wins, and the man who dies is not a kingpin or a threat to anyone outside that house. He's just a horrible person who ran out of luck in a very specific way. The bit that actually matters comes after. Jesse wipes down every surface he's touched, and the ATM door pops open on its own while he's cleaning it, which is either a very cruel joke or the universe having a laugh. He takes some of the cash, rings 911, leaves the phone off the hook so the call gets traced, and then goes and gets the boy. He tells him to close his eyes like they're playing peekaboo, carries him out past his father's body, sits him on the front step, and wraps a blanket round him. Says someone's coming, says have a good rest of your life, kid. 2 things worth knowing about this one. The first is that David Uri, who plays Spooge, has said he worked out a whole backstory where the character used to be an EMT or a nurse, someone with access to prescription medication who started using and never stopped. And there is actual evidence for it in the script, because Spooge occasionally drops a bit of proper medical vocabulary that a bloke in that living room has no business knowing. Once you've heard that, you can't unhear it, and it makes the whole thing about 3 times sadder. The second is much simpler. The cold open of that same episode is Skinny Pete stepping on a beetle. Breaking Bad is not always subtle, and it's usually not trying to be. The other performance in that house is Dale Dickey's, and I don't think she gets nearly enough credit for it. She plays Spooge's girlfriend, and she's on screen in 2 episodes. And she does about 4 different things with it. She's threatening when she needs to be. She takes Jesse out with a bottle without hesitating, and then there's this awful stretch where she promises she'll be a better mother if he'll just give her something, and she means it in the moment, and neither of them believes it. And after she kills him, she takes what's in his pocket, walks across the room, and passes out on the sofa. That's her reaction. That's the entire funeral. The show doesn't tell you what happens to her afterwards. She's arrested, presumably, off-screen, and that's that. It's worth saying what this episode does to Jesse because it's the start of a long thread. Up to this point, Jesse has mostly been comic relief with a bad haircut. He's out of his depth, he's frightened of everybody, and the show is quite happy to laugh at him. And then it puts him in a house with a neglected child for an afternoon, and something in the character changes permanently. Everything that comes later runs through that room, Andrea and Brock. The way he reacts to the boy on the bike. The reason he can't let it go. The whole final season of his story is a man trying to get one child out of a bad house, over and over, and this is the first time he manages it. He also, and this is the detail that gets me, doesn't tell anybody. He goes home, and Walt never finds out, and it never becomes a bargaining chip or a speech. He just did it, and then didn't mention it. Now, let's go somewhere else entirely, because I want to talk about a death that a lot of people got very wrong. This one started as a joke in the writer's room. Jennifer Hutchison, who wrote for the show for years, pitched the tortoise as a gag. And rather than laugh and move on, everyone in that room went, yes, obviously that's the scene. Which tells you a great deal about how that show was actually made. Tortuga is a cartel runner who's been informing to the DEA on the side. Danny Trejo plays him, and he's in the show for about 90 seconds of real screen time. And I'd put him in the top 5 guest performances in the series without much of an argument. The scene is a negotiation in an El Paso office. Hank's been transferred down there, nobody likes him, most of the room is speaking Spanish that he doesn't follow, and he's compensating by being loud. And Tortuga just sits there, completely unbothered. He explains that he's a patient man, that he's been doing this a long time, that he'll get what he wants eventually, and there's no particular hurry. Hank tries to strong-arm him and it bounces straight off. Then a few days later, the team is out in the desert on a stakeout, and Hank spots something moving on the plain. It's a tortoise, walking. And Tortuga's severed head is mounted on its shell, with Hola D painted across the back. The agents find this funny. That's the detail people forget. They stand around it, laughing, taking the mickey out of Hank for going pale and backing off. One of them saying something about how he's acting like he's never seen a severed head on a tortoise before. And then one of them takes hold of the hair and lifts. There was C4 packed into the skull. 1 agent dead, 3 wounded. Vanko loses a leg below the knee, and Hank, still half deaf and staggering, gets his belt off and ties a tourniquet round it. This is the bit I want to sit with because it's the measuring stick for the rest of this video. The cartel absolutely believed they were delivering justice. In their framework, Tortuga was a rat. He'd broken the one rule that matters. And the tortoise was the sentence and the press release in one object. It's theatrical because it's meant to be read, but the people who actually died out there weren't him. He was already dead when the scene starts. The person killed on screen is a DEA agent doing a stakeout, and the person maimed is a man who was, admittedly, being a bit of a prick about it, but who'd done nothing to anyone. That's the pattern. Almost every act of so-called justice in this show lands on somebody standing nearby. One last thing, and it's the bit that quietly matters most. This is where Hank breaks. The panic attack in the SUV is the first proper crack in him, and it's the reason he gets sent back to Albuquerque, which means the single most consequential thing about Tortuga's death is that it puts Hank Schreider back in the same city as Walter White. There's a bleak little detail in the earlier scene that I keep coming back to. When Tortuga is negotiating with the DEA, he's asking for money and immunity, and at one point, a car. And the agents are patient with him, they're taking notes, they're treating it as a normal Tuesday. Hank is the only one in the room getting frustrated, and everyone treats that as Hank being unprofessional, which he sort of is. But he's also the only person in there who has clocked that this man is going to die, and soon, and that the paperwork is not going to matter. He's right about that a lot, Hank. Right for the wrong reasons, or right at the wrong volume, but right. We do eventually find out who did it, by the way. Season 4 gives you a flashback to Tortuga's last afternoon. He's in a bar, and Juan Bolsa turns up and tells him there's a late birthday present waiting in the back room. Tortuga is pleased. He goes through, and the cousins are stood there, which reframes the earlier scene entirely because it means the two men we've been watching cross the desert on their elbows also, at some point, sat down with a machete and a live tortoise and worked out the staging. Somebody had to source the animal. Somebody had to paint the shell. It's a project. I find that funnier than I probably should. Right. Let's talk about a street corner. There's a boy on a bicycle riding in slow circles at the end of a street. He's 11. His name is Tomas, and he is the first thing Jesse notices when he starts asking questions. Combo had been shot on that corner months earlier. He was one of Jesse's, outselling in territory that belonged to somebody else. And two men in a car pulled up, stared at him until he told them to move along, then drove down the block and waited. And a child rode up on a bike and shot him because that was the initiation. Jesse learns this in the worst possible way. He's been seeing a woman from his recovery group called Andrea. He's met her little brother, and then she tells him quietly that Tomas was involved in something on that corner. And it lands. What follows is the meeting. Gus arranges it because both sides of this now work for him and he doesn't like waste. Jesse sits at a table with the two men who ordered his friend killed, and Gus extracts a promise from them that they'll stop using children. And Jesse is made to promise to keep the peace. Everybody at that table knows exactly what that promise is worth. Tomas is dead that night, shot on the same corner because he stopped being useful and started being a witness. And Jesse goes and takes a hit for the first time in months, sits in his car with a gun under the seat and waits. Then Walt's Aztec comes across the junction and hits both dealers at speed. One dies instantly under the wheels. The other goes over the bonnet and lands badly, and Walt gets out, walks over, takes the man's gun out of his reach, and shoots him in the head. Then he looks at Jesse and says one word, "Run." Then he looks at Jesse and says one word. This is the killing that most people, myself very much included, quietly approve of. And I want to be honest that it makes me a bit uncomfortable because look at what's actually happening. Two men used a child as a murder weapon and then killed the child. That's about as unambiguous as this show ever gets. If you're building a list of people who had it coming, they're on it without much debate. But Walt doesn't do it because of the boy. He watches a news report about Tomas, works out what Jesse is about to do, and drives across town at speed to stop Jesse getting himself killed, because Jesse is the only person in his life who still needs him. It's protective and it's possessive, and the moral outcome is almost incidental to him. He brings it up again much later in the desert, shouting at Jesse about everything he's done for him. I ran over those gangbangers, and he says it like it's a receipt. That's the thing about this section of the show. It hands you a death you're allowed to feel good about, and then spends 3 seasons quietly reminding you who handed it to you. There's an unresolved question hanging over this that the show never answers, and I quite like that it doesn't. Who ordered Tomas killed? The obvious reading is that the two dealers did it themselves because he'd been taken off the corner and he knew too much, and they were annoyed about being told what to do. That's what Jesse assumes, and it's probably right. But Gus had just sat in that meeting and instructed them to stop using children. And a dead boy on a street corner does solve the problem he'd been presented with in the most efficient possible way. And Gus is a man who has been shown to think exactly like that. There's no line of dialogue either way. The show just leaves the possibility sitting there. I don't think he did, for what it's worth. But I've had the argument twice and lost it once. Now, let's go back over the border because the Salamancas have sent 2 more. The cousins get 1 flashback, and it's the only characterization they need. Mexico, 1988. 2 small boys are fighting over a toy. One of them, Lionel, complains that his brother broke it and says, in the way that children say things, that he wishes Marco was dead. Their uncle is on the phone in the background, complaining about somebody he calls the Chicken Man, which is a lovely little detail if you know what's coming. Hector puts the phone down, calls Marco over, and holds his head under the water in an ice bath. Lionel pulls at him, begs. Hector doesn't move. Lionel eventually hits him in the face, and only then does he let go, and he tells him the only thing he ever really teaches them. La familia es todo. Family is everything. That's it. That's the entire operating system of these two men installed by a man drowning a child to make a point. 20-odd years later, they crawl on their stomachs across the desert to a roadside shrine to Santa Muerte. Not walk, crawl in immaculate suits, elbows in the dirt, all the way. They light candles and place a photograph in the middle of it, and at first that photograph is a police sketch of Heisenberg. Getting north is where they show you what they are. They're hidden in a lorry with a group of migrants, and one of the men in there notices their boots, the silver skull toe caps, and recognizes what they mean. He panics. He starts to say something. And they kill everyone in that lorry, then set it on fire with the bodies still inside. There's no anger in it. It's housekeeping. Somebody could describe them so nobody in that vehicle gets to arrive. Then Gus intervenes because two silent men with axes wandering around Albuquerque murdering his chemist is not good for business, and he redirects them at Hank instead on the technically true grounds that Hank is the one who actually killed Tuco. They go and kneel in front of Hector's wheelchair to ask permission first. That's the level of ritual we're dealing with. And then the car park. Hank gets a phone call. An unfamiliar voice tells him there are two men approaching his car and that he has 1 minute. And what makes the scene work is that Hank doesn't waste any of it. He doesn't freeze, he doesn't ring anyone, he gets his head up and starts looking. Right, and I want to be precise here because this bit gets misremembered constantly, including in a lot of videos about it. Hank sees Lionel first and reverses into him, and it's Lionel whose legs get crushed against the other car. Lionel is the one still standing. Then Lionel shoots him, riddles the SUV, and Hank ends up bleeding and out of ammunition. Then he spots one round on the floor of the car. He loads it, and Lionel comes for him with the axe raised, and Hank shoots him in the head at the last possible second. Marco dies there. Lionel doesn't. Lionel loses both legs, and while he's in a hospital bed a few doors down from Walt's family, he still tries to drag himself out and finish the job when he realizes who's in the building. Mike ends it with a needle. My honest opinion on these two is that they work precisely because they're barely characters. No English dialogue, no backstory beyond that one ice bath, no negotiation. They're weather. And I'll admit I found it slightly deflating when the prequel later gave them more to do and more to say, even though I enjoyed watching it. Some things are better when you can't see the whole shape of them. A few facts I love about the Moncada brothers who play them. Daniel and Luis are real brothers, but they're not twins. Luis is 3 years older. They auditioned together partly in improvised Spanish and had the parts within 2 days. And in the entire run of Breaking Bad, the cousins speak English exactly once in this episode, buying body armor from an arms dealer. The arms dealer says vests. Marco says they work. That's the lot. Also, Dean Norris has talked about shooting the inserts for that car park sequence, the shots of him lying on the tarmac after being hit. They filmed those separately in winter, which meant lying on freezing concrete for hours pretending to bleed out. Television is glamorous. The way they're introduced is worth a mention as well, because the show does it without a single word of explanation. Two men in immaculate suits get out of a car in a Mexican village and walk into a shop, and everyone inside goes very quiet. That's it. No dialogue, they buy nothing. And the audience understands the entire situation from the way a shopkeeper's shoulders move. Then they turn up in Albuquerque, and the show puts them in Walt's bedroom, sitting on the end of his bed with the axe across their knees, waiting for him to come out of the shower. And what stops them is a text message from Gus arriving at the last possible second. Walter White has no idea any of that happened. He walks out of that bathroom into an empty room and gets on with his day. That's my favorite kind of tension, honestly, the kind that resolves without the character ever learning it existed. A last note on the cousins, which is that they got a proper send-off years later in a completely different show. The prequel puts them in a desert episode that is essentially 2 men and a bag of money and a very long walk, and it's one of the best hours either series produced. It also gives them small human moments that the original never would have allowed. Marco takes his jacket off. There's a bit of business with a car. You can see the shape of 2 people rather than 2 threats. And it's slightly complicated to watch, knowing where they end up. Knowing about the ice bath and the shrine and a car park in Albuquerque with a minute on the clock. The thing they never get in either show is a reason. Nobody ever asks them why they do this, and nobody ever explains it. It's just the sentence their uncle taught them when they were young, running on a loop, right? Let's stay with Gus for a bit, because the ledger is about to get complicated. Did Victor deserve it? Probably not, is my answer, and I'll come back to why the scene still works so well despite that. But let's do the sequence first, because the case against him is actually more substantial than people remember. Jesse shoots Gale in the doorway of his own flat. Victor has been sent to stop exactly that and arrives too late. And then he makes a series of decisions that are, in fairness to Gus, catastrophic. He runs into the building. 3 neighbors see him do it. He goes into the flat, confirms Gale is dead, and runs back out, past the same neighbors, who later give the police a description accurate enough to matter. Then he leaves his own car sitting outside the building and drives Jesse's instead, at gunpoint. Back at the lab, Mike asks him the question directly. Did anyone see you? And Victor looks at the floor for a second before saying yes, and then tries to wave it off, says he was just another rubbernecker in the crowd. And Mike calls Gus, which is one of the coldest lines in the show once you know what it means. Then everybody waits. And while they wait, Victor decides to cook. He's watched Walt do it for weeks, and he runs a batch himself in front of Walt and Jesse before Gus arrives. And you can see Walt's face doing arithmetic, because his entire survival strategy is being irreplaceable, and a bloke with no chemistry training has just demonstrated otherwise. Gus arrives, takes off his jacket, puts on a hazmat suit deliberately, slowly, while nobody says anything, picks up a box cutter, and everyone in that room, including us, is completely certain he's about to kill Walt. There are 3 readings of what happens instead, and I think all 3 are correct simultaneously, which is why the scene has survived this long. The first is practical. Victor is a liability now. Witnesses can describe him, his car was at the scene, and Gus does not keep people who can be placed at murders. The second is about hierarchy. Victor overstepped. He took a job that wasn't his and performed it in front of the man whose job it was, and Walt puts it best 2 seasons later when he says Victor flew too close to the sun and got his throat cut. The third is the one that actually explains the staging. Gus needed Walt and Jesse to watch something happen to somebody else. Killing them solves nothing because he still needs a chemist. Killing the loyal one in front of them in silence tells them precisely how much loyalty is worth in that building. Then he cleans himself up, changes back into the suit, and tells them to get back to work. Not shouting, just, well, get back to work. That's the moment Gus stops being a businessman on screen for me. Everything before that you could read as a man managing risk. After that, you can't. Small thing. Victor's surname is never given in either show. He's around for years, and we never learn it. Watch Mike in that scene, by the way. He's the only person in the room who isn't surprised, and he's still not happy about it. Mike had worked with Victor for years. He'd vouch for him, presumably. And when Gus is finished, Mike is the one who has to deal with what's on the floor, and he does it without a word. And then there's a shot of him afterwards, sat down, looking at nothing in particular. That's the first real crack between those two, and it takes a season and a half to matter, but it starts there. There's also a very quiet piece of housekeeping in that episode that I love. Gus goes to Gale's flat after all this, or rather his people do, and the whole cleanup operation runs in the background of scenes about other things. The show has an entire subplot about disposing of a body, and it never once stops to explain it to you. Now, before we go any further into the cartel, I want to stop and talk about the man whose death started all this, because he's the reason the word deserved needs testing at all. The way I always think of Gale is the karaoke video. There's a home recording of him singing a Thai pop song badly with total sincerity into a webcam. It turns up after his death, and Hank and the team sit in a room watching it, and nobody quite knows what to do with their face. That's the man. That's the whole man in 90 seconds. He had a flat full of plants he was growing under lamps. He made his own coffee with proper laboratory glassware and got genuinely excited about it. And it was, by Walt's own grudging admission, the best coffee he'd ever had. He was a vegan. He read Whitman and left an inscription in a book that eventually helps get Walt caught, which is a joke the universe took 5 years to set up. He also cooked industrial quantities of methamphetamine for a man who murdered people, and he knew that. I'm not going to pretend he didn't. He had a whole philosophy about it that he explains to Gus in his job interview. This idea that people are going to use regardless, and he'd rather it be pure and safe than cut with something that blinds them. It's a rationalization. He probably knew that too. And he's in this video for a reason, which is this. Gale is the flat contradiction of the premise. Everyone else we've talked about so far died in a way that has some rough relationship to how they lived. Emilio pulled a gun and lost. Tuco was a hazard and got removed. The dealers used a child and it came back on them. Gale opens his front door in his slippers and gets shot by a man who is crying while he does it. And the reason is that a chemistry teacher decided he needed to be the only person in the world who could do a particular job. That's it. That's the entire cause. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't a rival in any sense he'd have recognized. He was replaceable, and being replaceable was fatal. I'm not going to spend 20 minutes litigating whether he was naive because I don't think it matters. And I think people who do that are looking for a way to make themselves comfortable. He broke the law knowingly, and he was killed for being competent and inconvenient. Those aren't the same crime, and only one of them carried a sentence. He didn't deserve it. That's the standard for everything that follows. His job interview is the other scene I'd point anyone to. Gus asks him why he's doing this, given the qualifications he's got, and Gale gives him this whole considered answer about the free market and consenting adults, and how if it's going to exist, it may as well be made properly by someone who cares. And Gus listens to all of it, completely still, and then hires him. And there's a moment in there where Gale asks a question back about why a man who runs a chicken restaurant is funding a laboratory. And Gus gives him a non-answer, and Gale accepts it immediately because he wants the job. That's the whole tragedy in one exchange. He asked once, got fobbed off, and decided not to ask again. And there's one more piece of him that outlives him by 2 full seasons. Gale kept lab notes, meticulously, a whole notebook of process, observations, little diagrams, and because he was that sort of person, some poetry copied out in the margins. That notebook ends up on the desk of the DEA and gives Hank an enormous amount of what he eventually understands. And inside the front cover, there's an inscription in a book of Whitman that Gale gave to Walt, addressed to WW, signed with his own initials. Walt keeps it. Of course he keeps it, because he's vain, and because part of him genuinely liked the man. He leaves it in his own bathroom, where his brother-in-law, a serving DEA agent, eventually picks it up while sitting on the toilet. 5 years of surveillance, wiretaps, and forensics, and the case cracks because Walter White couldn't throw away a compliment. I think Gale would have found that very funny, which somehow makes it worse, right? Let's go to Mexico, in a swimming pool. The pool is the whole section, really. It shows up twice, 20 years apart, and it's the same pool both times. The first visit is 1989. Gus and his partner Max have a chicken business and a proposal, and they've been handing out free samples of Max's product to Eladio's men without asking permission first. which in that world is not marketing, it's an insult. So Eladio has them brought to the hacienda. He's charming about it. He's always charming. He explains the disrespect calmly, poolside in a dressing gown, with the tone of a man explaining a parking violation. And then Hector Salamanca shoots Max in the head at the edge of the water while Gus is held down and made to look at it. And Eladio's reaction is the bit that matters. He doesn't gloat exactly, he just isn't interested. It's already over for him before the body has settled. 20 years later, Gus comes back to that house. Stephen Bauer is superb in this, by the way. Eladio in the present is a man who has been in charge so long that he stopped bothering to perform it. He greets Gus like an old colleague, tells him that everything between them was only ever business, that emotion shouldn't come into it, that he should stop sulking and enjoy the party. There's a moment where he sits down next to Gus and more or less tells him to get over the death of his friend, and he means it kindly, which is somehow much worse. Gus has brought a gift, a bottle of tequila called Zafiro Añejo, the kind of thing you bring when you're rebuilding a relationship, and Eladio is visibly delighted by it. He has a waiter pour shots for everybody in the courtyard. Not Mike, who is staff, not Jesse, because Gus quietly says the boy is an addict and needs to stay sober to be useful. And Eladio takes the glass straight back out of his hand. Then right at the toast, Eladio stops. He looks at Gus over the glass. He's not stupid, he's never been stupid, and something about the evening isn't sitting right. And Gus drinks first, without a flicker. That's the moment. That's the whole plan in one swallow. Everything after it is just chemistry taking its course. They all drink, there's a party, women arrive, music, the lot. And Gus asks to use the bathroom, walks in with a capo escorting him, turns the tap on, and makes himself sick into the toilet. He'd taken activated charcoal beforehand to buy himself a few extra minutes, but the margin is thin and you can see it costing him. Then the courtyard starts falling over, one at a time, then several at once. Mike Garot's gaffe. And Eladio, who has felt it coming for about 90 seconds and can't do anything about it, stumbles across the tiles towards Gus, gets his legs tangled, and goes into the pool. The same pool. That's not subtle either, and I don't care because it works. I'll say it plainly. That's the most satisfying killing in the entire series for me, and it isn't the violence, because there barely is any, it's the patience. It's a man who waited 20 years, walked back into the room where it happened, and drank the poison himself first to make sure everyone else would. Now, the fun fact on this one is genuinely one of my favorites in the whole show. Zafiro Añejo doesn't exist. The production tried to get a real tequila brand into the scene, as you do, and every single company said no once they understood the premise, which is that everybody who drinks the product dies horribly within 4 minutes. Fair enough, honestly. So the writers invented a brand and gave it a name that just means sapphire, and it went on to become one of the most emotionally loaded props in the prequel series, where a bottle cap ends up carrying more weight than most characters. One other detail while we're here. Jesse's cookdown in that lab comes out at 96.2%, which is lower than Walt's usual and higher than Gale ever managed. And he does it in a facility where they had to synthesize half the precursors on site. He's genuinely good at this. Nobody in that building ever tells him so. A quick word on Eladio's house, because the production design is doing a lot of quiet work. It's not a fortress. There's no visible security beyond a handful of men in short sleeves. It's a very nice villa with a courtyard and a pool and some old tiling, and it looks like a place where a comfortable man has been comfortable for a very long time, which is exactly why the poisoning works. Nobody in that courtyard has needed to be careful in years. They check the bottle because it's a habit, not because they think anything is going to happen, and the moment Gus swallows, they all stop thinking about it entirely. Comfort is the actual weapon in that scene. The tequila is just the delivery system. The escape afterwards is worth a minute on its own because the episode doesn't stop when the poisoning does. Gus is failing. He's had the charcoal, he's emptied his stomach, and he's still absorbing enough to put him on the floor. Mike takes a round in the gut from cartel men in the desert earlier, not from Gaff's men on the way out. And the person who ends up driving 3 grown men away from a compound full of bodies on unfamiliar roads in a country he's never been to is Jesse Pinkman. Jesse, who has spent most of the series being told he's an idiot. He gets him to a hospital, he keeps Mike conscious. He does the whole thing without anything remotely resembling a plan, and nobody thanks him for that either. Then there's Gaff, who I always feel slightly sorry for. He's the one who didn't drink because he was on duty. Being the only sober professional in the room is generally a good survival strategy, and on this particular afternoon, it bought him about 4 extra minutes. Right, and since we've spent so long on Gus's grudge, we should probably talk about the other half of it. Everything about Hector eventually comes down to a bell. It's a little chrome desk bell, the kind you'd hit on a hotel counter, cable tied to the arm of his wheelchair. And for 4 seasons across 2 shows, that bell does everything. It's how he says yes. It's how he says no. It's how he calls someone an idiot, which he manages surprisingly often with one moving finger. Before the chair, though, Hector was the man in the ice bath story. He was the one who shot Max at the pool. He was a ruthless cartel enforcer, and he was extremely good at it, and the thing that comes across in every flashback is that he enjoyed it. Not in a theatrical way, he just found other people's fear pleasant. Then the stroke. And here's where Gus makes the choice that eventually kills him. Hector goes down, and Gus has the money and the access to make sure he receives the best possible medical care. And he does exactly that. He keeps him alive. He funds the nursing home. He visits. There's a scene at Hector's bedside where Gus tells him a story about being a boy and catching a coati, an animal that had been stealing fruit from his family's trees. He waited hours for it. And when he finally caught it, he says the kind thing would have been to finish it there. He didn't. He put it in a cage instead, and it went on living for a good while after that. He tells us to a man who cannot move or speak, in a room the man cannot leave. That's the whole strategy. A quick death is a mercy, and Gus is not in the mercy business. He wants Hector alive long enough to watch every Salamanca die in front of him, and he very nearly gets the full set. What Hector does with that is, I think, the single most impressive thing anyone does in the show. He agrees to go to the DEA office. He knows Gus has men watching. He goes in there and sits in front of Hank and refuses to speak, and instead writes on a pad. And what he writes is deliberately vile, aimed at Hank, at Hank's family, at everyone in the room. He makes himself repulsive on purpose in the one room where Gus's people can see him doing it. Because he understands the one thing Gus cannot tolerate. Not a threat, not a rival, a rat. And Gus takes the bait entirely. He goes to the nursing home himself, sends Tyrus in to sweep the room first, and then stands over the chair and tells Hector exactly what he thinks of him. Asks if this is really how he wants to be remembered. And Hector looks up. For a second, Gus thinks he's seeing tears, and honestly, so did I the first time. Then the face changes and Hector starts hitting the bell, over and over, faster, and you can see the exact moment Gus understands. He's about a second too late. My read on Hector is that he's the only person in this entire series who chooses his own death and gets precisely the one he wanted. Everyone else is caught out. He isn't. He sat in a chair for years, unable to speak, being kept alive as a punishment, and he found a way to turn his own humiliation into the trigger. That's a strange sort of victory, but it is definitely a victory. Mark Margolis, by the way, first turns up in that desert cabin episode in what was written as a small part. He then plays the role for the best part of a decade across 2 series, almost entirely without dialogue, and gets an Emmy nomination for an episode where his big scene is a facial expression. The bell has an origin, incidentally, and it's a good one. In the prequel, you see Hector before the stroke, and then you see the stroke itself, and then you see him in a hospital bed with absolutely no way of communicating with anyone. His nephews are stood there useless. and a physiotherapist works out a system with a picture board and a bell, and Hector, who has spent his entire life being obeyed, has to learn to ask for a glass of water by ringing at people. Which means the bell isn't a quirk, it's a leash, and everyone in that family knows it. And it's why the ending works. The one object that represented his total helplessness is the one he uses to take out the man who put him there. He spends years being rung at like a hotel guest, and then at the very end, he gets to ring for something himself. I'd call that poetry, but the show would probably be embarrassed. Right? You know where we're going next. Let's start with the napkins. There's a shot of Gus in a Los Pollos Hermanos restaurant, in the yellow shirt, in the tie, and the manager's badge, straightening a stack of napkins on a table nobody is sitting at. He picks up litter in the car park. He asks customers how their meal was and actually waits for the answer. And this is a man who that same week has probably signed off on 2 or 3 deaths. The cover isn't a disguise. That's what I love about it. He genuinely runs the chicken business. It's profitable, it's well managed, it's expanding. He sponsors a DEA fundraiser and hands out free food to the men investigating him. And he does it as a legitimate local businessman being a good neighbor, because he actually is a legitimate local businessman being a good neighbor. It's just that the same distribution network moves both products. He puts it to Walt directly at one point, this idea that the two of them are doing the same thing, concealing themselves out in the open where nobody thinks to look. Which is generous of him, because Walt conceals himself about as well as a house fire. The empire is genuinely impressive when you lay it out. 14 restaurants, a chicken farm for distribution, an industrial laundry with a lab underneath it, which is the sort of thing that gets built by someone who thinks in 20-year increments. He'd spent decades getting into a position where he could do what he did in that courtyard in Mexico, and where he could keep the man in the wheelchair breathing. And every part of that patience is the thing that kills him. Because after the box cutter and after the poolside, Gus has a problem he can't file away neatly. Walt keeps not dying. So Gus goes to the desert, tells him he's finished, and then delivers the threat that ends any possibility of coexistence. He lists Walt's family, the wife, the son, and then the baby, itemized one at a time so there's no ambiguity about the scope of it. Flat, no emphasis. Delivered like an order confirmation. And that's the point where Walt stops trying to survive Gus and starts trying to aim him. The plan isn't an attack. Walt has no realistic way to attack Gus, and he knows it. What he has is the one thing Gus won't be rational about. So Walt goes to the nursing home himself, sits in front of Hector, and offers him the only thing he's wanted for years. Then the DEA visit happens, then the bell. The approach to that room is worth watching just for the tradecraft. Gus doesn't march in. He parks, he waits, he sends Tyrus ahead to sweep the corridor and check the room, and only when it's clean does he go in. He is careful right up until the last 30 seconds of his life, and the thing that gets him isn't a lapse in security. It's that he wanted to say something to Hector's face before it was over. Then the explosion. And then the shot everyone remembers. Gus walks out of the room into the corridor and stops. He adjusts his tie. It's the most composed he's looked all season, and the camera moves around and there's nothing left of the right side of his head. He goes down, and that's it. No line, no last word. What makes that death land harder than anything else in the series for me is that it's engineered entirely out of one flaw. Gus isn't outmaneuvered financially or outfought or caught by the DEA. He's killed by the one grudge he refused to put down, using a man he insisted on keeping alive specifically so he could keep punishing him. Nobody else in Breaking Bad dies of their own defining trait quite that cleanly. Now, the production on that shot, because it's a genuinely mad story, Vince Gilligan wrote and directed the episode. The practical prosthetics on Giancarlo Esposito took roughly 4.5 hours to apply every day they shot it. And for the makeup itself, they brought in KNB-EFX, along with Greg Nicotero and Howard Berger, who were at that point running the effects on The Walking Dead. Same network, so it was a slightly easier phone call than it might have been. Then the visual effects team had to remove most of what the makeup department had just spent all morning building, because the prosthetic was there to sell the lighting and the shadows rather than to be the final image. They ended up replacing a large portion of the head digitally, tracking markers and all. The detail that VFX people always point at is the eye. The remaining eye tracks correctly, looking where the missing one would be looking, and your brain accepts the whole thing because of that one small piece of correctness. And the walk itself, out of the door, the tie, the collapse, took 19 takes. There's also a long-running argument about whether he'd have stayed on his feet at all, which doctors have weighed in on more than once over the years. The in-universe answer people generally settle on is that he heard the bell and turned, so the blast caught him side on rather than square, which bought him about 8 seconds. 8 seconds, and he spent them walking out of the room. There's a scene I always come back to with him, and it's not a violent one. He's asked to identify a body, and he stands in a room with a DEA agent and gives a small, sad, completely convincing performance about a man he in fact had killed. And afterwards, in the car park, he takes about 2 seconds to reset his face. He does this constantly. There's a fundraiser where he stands at a lectern in front of a room of federal agents and makes a warm little speech and hands over a check and shakes hands with the man who is actively investigating him. I've heard people call it arrogance, and I don't think it is. I think he calculated correctly that the safest place to stand is next to the people looking for you, and that nobody looks twice at a man holding a tray of free chicken. The thing the show never fully explains about him, and I mean never, is where he came from. There's a flashback where Eladio, mid-conversation, makes a pointed remark about knowing exactly who Gus is and what he was doing in Chile, and says, "The name means nothing here, and that's it. That's your lot." Vince Gilligan has said in interviews that they knew roughly what the answer was and deliberately never put it on screen on the grounds that it was more frightening if the audience had to sit with the gap. We know he built a chicken restaurant with a man he loved in a country that wasn't his, and that a man shot that person in front of him at a poolside, and that he then spent 2 decades constructing an entire legitimate business empire as a delivery mechanism for a grudge. That's more than enough architecture. There's also the madrigal side of it, which is the bit people forget. Los Pollos Hermanos isn't independent. It's a subsidiary of a German conglomerate, and when Gus dies, a senior executive in Hanover locks himself in a staff toilet and kills himself with a defibrillator rather than face the investigation. That's how far the shockwave travels. A man in Germany who is a top madrigal executive dies because of an explosion at a nursing home in Albuquerque. Right. Let's move forward because the next lot are a very different proposition. 2 minutes, 3 prisons, 10 men. That's the brief, and Walt sets the clock himself. The origin of it is Lydia, who I'll come to properly later. After Gus dies, everyone who ever worked for him is suddenly a person with information and no reason to keep it. And Lydia hands Mike a list of 11 names and suggests, in the tone of someone raising an agenda item, that they should all be killed. Mike refuses. Mike knows these men, has worked with them for years, and has been paying them out of his own share, specifically so they stay quiet. His position is that they're professionals and they'll hold. And then Walt gets involved, and Mike is arrested, and the money he'd set aside for those families gets seized, and suddenly a group of loyal men have every reason in the world to start talking. So Walt goes to Todd's Uncle Jack, sits in a room with him, and explains what he wants. And Jack, to his credit, actually pushes back a bit. Says he's not sure it can even be done. Not on that time scale, not across multiple facilities. Walt doesn't negotiate. He tells him to work it out, because that's what the money is for. What follows is one of the hardest sequences in the show to watch, and it's the editing that does it. It's cut fast and scored with a jaunty little piece of music, and it moves between 3 locations while a stopwatch runs. Stabbings. A man set on fire in his cell. It's over before you've properly worked out what you're looking at, which is precisely the horror of it. And then there's Dan Waxberger, the lawyer, who'd been couriering money to the families. He goes in the same operation. He'd flipped, so his usefulness had reversed. Now, here's why this section exists and why it's the hardest case in the video. Some of those men had done genuinely terrible things. They worked for a man who murdered people. A few of them almost certainly killed people themselves. Under any rough scoring system, several of them belong on a list of people who had it coming. But none of them were killed for any of that. Not one. They were killed for being able to open their mouths. That's the distinction I keep coming back to. Deserving requires the punishment to have something to do with the crime. And here, the two have nothing whatsoever to do with each other. It's not justice with a bad accent. It's a filing problem being solved with a knife. And this is the exact scene where Walt stops being a man you can root for, at least for me. Not the poisoning of a child, not the desert, not what he does to Jesse later. This. Because everything else he does has some scrap of self-justification attached, some story about family or survival that he can tell himself in the car home. This is just a spreadsheet. He watches part of it on the news afterwards, in his own kitchen, and then goes and gets on with his day. The scoring of that sequence is the bit that people argue about, and I'm on the side that thinks it's the right call. It's a bouncy, almost cheerful piece of music, and it runs the whole way through, over everything. And the effect is that you're watching something appalling at a slight remove the way Walt is watching it, which is to say, as a logistics problem being solved on schedule. If it were scored the obvious way, with strings and dread, it would be a scene about how sad it all is. Scored like this, it's a scene about how easy it was. The people on that list had names, and I think it's worth saying that they weren't anonymous even inside the show. Dennis Markowski ran the laundry. He's the one who ends up in a cell as the smoke comes in. Chris and Tyrus had worked security. Ron Forinall was the chemical supplier. Most of them had been on Gus's payroll for years, and Mike had personally selected them, personally paid them, and personally guaranteed their silence with money he'd set aside for their families. That's the bit that finishes Mike, really, not the arrest, not losing the money. The fact that the men he vouched for died because he was no longer in a position to keep his end of it. And Walt's contribution to that conversation later is to point out that it all worked out because none of them talked, which brings us to the men who actually carried it out. The thing everybody notices about Todd first is the manners. He calls him Mr. White. Not once sarcastically, always. He's polite to Jesse, who is openly hostile to him. He's tidy, he's punctual, he takes notes. He wants to do a good job and to be told he's done a good job. If you described him to someone without context, you'd be describing an ideal junior employee. He turns up as an exterminator, working for Vamonos Pest, and gets pulled into the operation because he's already inside people's houses with a tent over them. Then the train, the heist itself, is a brilliant hour of television, and one of the few times the show lets its characters have unambiguous fun. They siphon 1,000 gallons of methylamine out of a tanker in the middle of nowhere and replace it with water, and it goes perfectly, and the 3 of them are stood there grinning at each other in the sand. And then a boy on a dirt bike comes over the ridge. He'd been out collecting insects. He's got a jar. He waves at them, this small, friendly wave, because he doesn't know what he's just seen. And Todd takes out a pistol and shoots him. What matters isn't the shot. It's the next 30 seconds and the next episode and every scene after that. There's no reaction. He doesn't panic, doesn't apologize beyond a sort of procedural shrug about how they all agreed nobody could know. He's genuinely puzzled that the others are upset. He says something about how he's a team player. Later, in his flat, that boy's tarantula is sitting in the jar on a shelf. He kept it. That's Todd. It's not cruelty, quite, because cruelty requires you to understand what you're doing to someone. It's an absence. There's nothing happening behind the eyes at all, and the politeness sits on top of it like a tablecloth. After that, he escalates, but he never changes. He and Jack's men gun down Declan's crew in the desert. He gets promoted to head cook because Lydia needs product, and he's the only one left who will try. He develops what is unmistakably a crush on Lydia, and it comes out in these small, awful ways, complimenting her blouse, keeping her teabag preferences in his head, getting flustered about purity numbers because she's disappointed in him. And then there's Jesse. Jesse is kept chained in a pit under the lab, brought up to cook and put back down afterwards, beaten when the yield drops. And when he escapes and gets caught at the fence, Todd doesn't kill him because Jesse is an asset. Instead, he drives to Andrea's house. Jesse is in the car, gagged, watching. Todd knocks on her door, tells her Jesse sent him, waits for her to step out onto the porch, and says, before he does it, that this isn't anything to do with her. Then he goes back to the car and tells Jesse they're still Brock, so behave. He is, comfortably, the most frightening person in the series, and I've thought about why for a long time. Gus was frightening because of what he'd decided. Tuco was frightening because he was unpredictable. Todd is frightening because there's nothing there to appeal to. You cannot threaten him, reason with him, disgust him, or shame him. He'll agree with you pleasantly and do it anyway, which is why the finale gives him to Jesse and gives him the chain. Jesse gets him from behind with the shackles he's been kept in for months, and it's not clean or quick, and he doesn't let go early. It's about as close to catharsis as that show ever offers. Two things worth knowing. Jesse Plemons was cast largely on the back of Friday Night Lights, where he'd spent 5 years playing possibly the most guileless, decent boy on American television. The show is absolutely trading on that residue, and it works, because your brain keeps insisting he's harmless. And the sound design on his neck breaking is one of the most complained about audio moments in the entire series, which I assume was the intention. One more thing, which is the money. Todd is being paid an enormous amount, and there's no evidence he does anything with it at all. He lives in an unremarkable flat. He drives a fairly ordinary car. He hasn't got a boat or a watch or any of the usual signifiers, and he never once talks about what he wants out of any of this. Everyone else in the show has an appetite you can name. Walt wants to be significant. Jack wants to be the biggest man in the room. Lydia wants a clean exit. Gus wanted one specific thing for 20 years. Todd just turns up to work. There's a coda to Todd that most people saw a few years later in the film. The follow-up to the series spends a lot of its running time with him in flashback, and it's the most unsettling material in the whole thing because it's all domestic. He's got a flat. He drives Jesse there to help move something. There's a cleaner, and there's a body under the sofa, and there's a bit of business with a tin of something in a kitchen cupboard, and the whole sequence is played almost as comedy right up until it isn't. And the reason there's a body is that she'd found his money, not stolen it. Found it while cleaning and put it back exactly where it was. He's completely undisturbed about it. He gets Jesse to help him carry her out, apologizes for the inconvenience of the trip, and buys them both a drink afterwards. That's the last piece of the character, and it's the one that confirms it. The politeness isn't a mask over something. There's nothing underneath for it to be a mask over. He's exactly as pleasant as he seems, and it makes no difference to anything he does. Now, his uncle. Everything about Jack starts with a hole in the desert, and with what Walt actually asks for. Walt rings him from Tohaji Lee, sees Hank's car, sees the DEA badge, and immediately tries to call it off. Says, "Forget it, don't come, cancel." And Jack asks him one question, which is essentially how many, and Walt says 2, and the plan is already moving. Jack is the least sophisticated villain in the show by an enormous margin. He has no cover business, no long game, no philosophy beyond a set of tattoos and a general willingness. His entire operation is a compound, a lot of guns, and a family loyalty that only points inwards. And for a stretch of season 5, he's more effective than anyone else has ever been, precisely because he doesn't think ahead far enough to be cautious. The shootout is brief. Gomez dies almost immediately. Hank takes one in the leg, drags himself upright, and the thing stops. Then it becomes a negotiation, and it's the worst scene in the series for a lot of people, myself included. Walt offers him $80 million, not for a deal, not for territory, for Hank's life. He's on his knees in the dirt, bargaining with a man who does not particularly want money at that moment, and Hank refuses to help him do it. That's the part that finishes me. He tells Walt he's the smartest man he ever met, and too stupid to see that Jack made his mind up 10 minutes ago. Then he tells him to do what he's going to do, and he does. Then Jack takes the barrels, digs up the money, loads 7 of the 8 onto his trucks, and leaves 1 behind because he's decided that's a reasonable gesture. $11 million left in a hole as a tip. And when Walt gives up Jesse out of pure spite and tells Jack to kill him, it's Todd who talks his uncle out of it on the grounds that Jesse can cook. The finale gives Jack the ending he earned, and the shape of it is very deliberate. The machine gun clears the room. Jack survives the first sweep, crawls, gets a cigarette lit, and starts talking. He's stalling, and his pitch is that if Walt kills him, he'll never find out where the money went. And Walt shoots him mid-sentence. Jack gets about 6 words into the threat and never reaches the end of it. Exactly what happened to Hank. Same setup, same interruption, and I don't think that's a coincidence for a second. What I find interesting about that moment is that it's the one point in the finale where Walt isn't performing. Everything else he does at night is planned, staged, and slightly theatrical because he's a man writing his own last act. Shooting Jack in the middle of a word isn't any of that. That's just grief, arriving several months late. And he doesn't look at the money. It's sitting right there, and he never mentions it again. There's a moment I always notice at the very end of the shootout. After the gun stops, Walt is on the floor, and Jack is crawling, and everything is quiet apart from the mount still turning in the boot with a little mechanical whir. And Todd, before Jesse gets to him, is stood at the window looking at it. Not at the bodies, at the machine, genuinely interested in how it works. That's the last thing he ever does. The compound is worth a look because it tells you everything about the operation. There's no security to speak of. There's a shed, a lot of vehicles, some dogs, and a group of men who mostly seem to be sitting around. Kenny, the second in command, spends most of his screen time being obnoxious in a way that's almost funny. When Walt drives in at the end, nobody sweeps the car properly. They pat him down for a weapon on his body and don't look in the boot of the vehicle he arrived in. Gus would have had that car stripped to the chassis in a car park 2 miles away. And that's the joke of the last stretch of the show in a way. Walter White spent 4 years outmaneuvering the most careful criminal in the Southwest, and then got beaten and robbed by a group of men who couldn't be bothered to check the boot. Right, let's talk about the woman on the other end of the phone. Start with a sachet of sweetener because that's where this ends up. Lydia is the only white-collar villain in Breaking Bad, and I think that's why she irritates people so much more than her body count strictly warrants. She works at Madrigal Electromotive, a vast German conglomerate with a logistics division, and she runs a supply chain. She has an office, she has a lanyard. Her first proper scene is her sitting in a nearly empty restaurant, terrified, convinced Mike has come to kill her, wearing sunglasses indoors and shaking. And she begs, genuinely begs. And then, inside about 4 minutes of screen time, she puts a list of names on the table and proposes killing every one of them. That switch is the character. She is frightened all the time, and she is absolutely lethal, and the two aren't in tension at all. The fear is the engine. She never touches anybody. She wouldn't know how. What she does instead is arrange things, and the vocabulary she uses to do it is pure corporate. Throughput, distribution, quality control, growth markets. She's the one who opens up the Czech Republic and turns a regional operation into an export business. She talks about 92% market penetration like she's presenting to a board. Then Walt retires and she panics because a supply chain without a supplier is just an expensive problem. She tries Declan, decides he's unserious. She tries Todd, sacks him after one bad cook, then goes crawling back to him because he's the only option left. And when Todd needs Declan's operation cleared out to do it, she sets that up too, and then makes a point of not looking at the bodies. She actually says it, tells him to wait, keeps her back turned, walks past afterwards without glancing down. That's her whole moral system in one gesture. She'll order it, she just won't look at it. Then the coaching. Todd gets close to Walt's numbers and never quite gets there, and Lydia picks at him about it constantly, nagging a man who has murdered a child about product consistency. And underneath all of it, the tea, chamomile, soy milk, stevia, same cafe, same table, Tuesdays at 10 in the morning every single week for months. It's a nervous ritual, a bit of control she can hold on to while everything else is on fire, and it's very human, and I do actually find it a little bit endearing, which makes the ending better. In the finale, she orders as usual and notices there's only one sachet and asks for another. Todd compliments the color of her blouse, and then Walt sits down at their table and asks them not to panic. He knew she'd be there because she is a woman of habit and routine, and he says so out loud, which is arguably the meanest thing anyone says to her. She plays it beautifully, feigns interest in his offer, and the second he's out of the door, she tells Todd they're not doing a deal, they're killing him. Then that night, sweating, ill, she rings Todd's phone to check it's done. Walt answers, and he tells her that the ricin went into the stevia. That's it. That's the conversation. Where I land on Lydia is that she's more culpable than Jack and less frightening than Todd, and the show knows exactly that, which is why she gets the pettiest death of the lot. No confrontation, no gun, no last stand. She's poisoned by her own routine, over the phone, by a man who isn't even in the room. One properly nerdy detail. Ricin generally denatures in very hot liquid, so poisoning someone's tea shouldn't really work. Except stevia denatures at roughly the same sort of temperature, which means Lydia has to be drinking it cool enough for the sweetener to survive, which means it's cool enough for the ricin as well. Whether that's a happy accident or somebody in that writer's room checking their homework, I genuinely don't know. The madrigal angle is also quietly the funniest thing in the show, in a very grim way. She works for a company that owns fast food chains and warehouses and a division that makes industrial fryers, and somewhere in among all that is a supply line for a Mexican cartel's precursor chemicals. And her job title is something so bland that when the DEA finally do look at her, the paperwork alone would take them a year. There's a scene where investigators are going through a madrigal facility and she stood there in the middle of it in a hard hat, helping, answering their questions, being useful. Which is more or less the same trick Gus was running, except she's doing it accidentally, out of blind terror, and it works just as well. One more thing about her, which is the only part of her I find genuinely difficult. Lydia has a daughter, small, maybe 6 or 7, and the reason Lydia gives, more than once, for absolutely everything she does, is that she has to be there for that child, and that she can't be arrested, and that she's already arranged the story her daughter will be told if she disappears. That's why she wants 11 people killed. It's why she pushes into Europe. It's why she keeps the operation alive after it stops making any sense to. She'd rather order a massacre than miss the school run, and it's not a lie, which is the awkward bit. She isn't performing it. In one of her early scenes with Mike, the reason he doesn't kill her, having driven all the way there to do exactly that, is that the child comes home early and he decides he can't. So the woman who arranged more deaths than most of the people we've talked about tonight survives about half the series on the strength of one afternoon, where a little girl came downstairs at the wrong moment. Since we've mentioned him twice now, let's give Declan his 2 minutes. Declan just wanted to sell meth in Arizona. That's genuinely the whole of it. He's a distributor out of Phoenix with a decent operation and a product running at about 68% purity, which is not good, and he knows it's not good, and he's fine with it because it sells. He's a businessman with modest ambitions and a slightly grubby product, which describes most businessmen. Then blue meth turns up in his territory and destroys his margins overnight. The scene everyone remembers is the buyout meeting out in the desert, 3 men on one side of a table and Declan on the other. And the thing that always strikes me on a rewatch is this. Declan is the only person in that scene behaving reasonably. He offers a deal. He offers to buy the methylamine outright at a serious price and let everybody walk away rich. Mike wants to take it. Jesse wants to take it. It's an extremely good offer, and Walt says no because he isn't in the meth business, he's in the empire business, which is a line I love, and which is also, when you strip the delivery away, a man refusing 5 million pounds out of vanity. So Declan ends up cooking Walt's product on Walt's terms with a share he never wanted, and doing it badly because his people aren't good enough. And then Lydia decides the numbers aren't good enough either, and Todd's uncle has a lot of men with guns. They come out to the desert lab and shoot everyone. Declan goes first. It takes about 40 seconds and the show doesn't dwell on any of it. I've put him in here for a reason, and it's a short reason, so this will be a short one. The body count in this series contains a lot of people whose worst crime was competing. Not violence, not betrayal, not using children, not any of the things we've been weighing up all the way through. Just being in the same market as someone with fewer scruples and better chemistry. Declan never threatened anybody. He negotiated, lost, complied, and was killed for underperforming. His crew get even less than he does. There's about 9 of them out at that lab, most of whom don't get a line, and they're gone inside a single wide shot. Breaking Bad usually gives you at least a face to attach to a death. Here, it deliberately doesn't, and I think the point is that by season 5, the show has stopped bothering to individuate the people Walt's decisions land on. They've become weather too. Although I'll add one thing because it stuck with me. The last we see of that operation is Todd standing in a lab that isn't his, in a desert that isn't his, with a job he isn't qualified for, because a woman in an office decided the numbers weren't right. Nobody in that scene wanted to be there. That's quite a good summary of the last third of this show. That's it. That's the section. Right. I want to do this one gently because it's the part where the title of the video has to answer for itself. Jane Margolis first. She's a recovering addict with a tattoo studio and a landlord's suspicion of Jesse, and she relapses, and she does try to blackmail Walt, so she isn't a saint. But what actually kills her is a man standing in a bedroom deciding not to move. He turns up to talk to Jesse, finds them both unconscious, knocks against the bed by accident and rolls her onto her back and then watches. That's the closest thing to an accident on this entire list, and it isn't one. It's the only killing Walt commits by doing nothing at all, and it's the one he cries about years later. Drew Sharp. The boy on the dirt bike with the insect jar. One wave, Andrea on her own front porch, told before it happened that it wasn't anything to do with her, which was true and which is exactly why it was unbearable. Combo on a street corner shot by a child who'd been handed a gun by adults. Mike sat on a rock by a river with his feet up, watching the water, packed and ready to go. He'd refused to give Walt the names, which he'd already refused once that afternoon, and Walt shot him over it and then stood there apologizing while Mike told him to shut up and let him die in peace. And the truly infuriating part, which Mike points out with about 10 seconds left, is that Walt could have got those names from Lydia at any point. He already had them. He killed a man over information he was holding. There's also everyone the show never bothers to name. The passengers in that lorry at the border, the clerk behind the counter of a shop somebody wanted a cash machine out of, the DEA agent who lifted a severed head off a tortoise because his colleagues were laughing, a room full of men in 3 separate prisons who were mostly guilty of having worked for the wrong employer, and Hank, in a hole in the desert, having finally, comprehensively won. He'd worked it out, he'd built the case, he'd made the arrest, He'd rung Marie to tell her. He was, for about 4 minutes, completely victorious. None of these people got what they deserved, and I want to be clear about what I mean by that. It isn't that they were innocent. Jane was blackmailing someone. Mike had killed people. Hank was a serving officer and a good one, and even he'd taken a man apart in an interrogation room he shouldn't have. It's that in every single case, the punishment had nothing to do with the crime. They died because they were standing in the way of somebody else's plan, and the plan didn't care who they were. That's the thing this show does that almost nothing else on television does as well. It gives you 6 or 7 deaths that feel like the universe balancing its books, so that you start to relax into it and expect the pattern. And then it kills Hank Schrader in the sand while his brother-in-law screams, and the pattern turns out to have been a coincidence the whole time. Mike's death is the one that still annoys me, if I'm honest, and it's not for emotional reasons, it's structural. It achieves nothing, it gains Walt nothing, protects nothing, changes nothing, and the character himself points that out while it's happening. I don't think that's a flaw in the writing. I think it's the writers being honest about how these things usually go. I should mention Gomez too, because he gets forgotten and he shouldn't. Stephen Gomez had worked alongside Hank for years, taken the mickey out of him constantly, covered for him, and been the only person at the DEA who believed him when the theory sounded insane. He's the one Hank rings when he can't ring anyone official. He goes out to that desert entirely off the books, on his friend's word, with no backup because Hank asked him to. And he's dead within about 9 seconds of the shooting starting off to the side of the frame, and nobody in the scene mentions him again. Then there's Drew Sharp's parents who never appear. There's one news report and a search and a bit of footage of a hillside with volunteers walking a line. And that's the total on-screen consequence of a child being killed and dissolved. Somebody somewhere is still looking for that boy at the end of the series, and the show never goes back to check, right? There's one person left. I don't want to start with the finale because I think it's the wrong end of him. I want to start with the kitchen. Season 5, near the end, Skylar in front of him, and Walt finally stops doing the voice. I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was really, truly alive. That's the confession, and it's the only completely honest thing he says in 5 years. Every justification he's built, the family, the cancer, the money, the legacy, comes apart in about 11 seconds of him admitting he enjoyed himself. So, the case against him: Crazy 8 in a basement, Emilio in an RV, 2 dealers on a street corner, Gail by proxy through the person least equipped to survive doing it, Gus engineered, Mike by the river, 10 men in a prison system in the time it takes to boil a kettle, and Brock, a child poisoned deliberately with a plant Walt grew in his own back garden, purely to manipulate Jesse into helping him. That last one is the one that ends any argument for me. Everything else has a story attached. That one is just a man using a child as a lever and then never mentioning it again. The case for it is thinner than people pretend. He was dying anyway. He was underappreciated badly by people who got rich off his work. He was frightened and humiliated and 50. All of that is true, and none of it is a defense because the show is very careful to give him an exit at every stage, and he declines every one. Gretchen and Elliot offer to pay for everything in season 1. He says no out of pride, and then spends 5 years telling everyone he had no choice. And then the last night, he turns 52. He sits in the same Denny's from the opening flash forward. He buys an M60 from an arms dealer in a car park, drives back to Albuquerque in a stolen Volvo, and then spends what I imagine was a very cold evening in a garage fitting that gun to a pivoting mount inside the boot of an old Cadillac, wired to the key fob so a button press swings it and fires. It's an absurd contraption. It's also exactly what a chemistry teacher would build. He goes to the compound, gets himself searched, gets on his knees, and provokes Jack into bringing Jesse up from the pit to prove a point about loyalty, which is the actual reason he does it, because he needed to know. Then he presses the button and tackles Jesse to the floor and takes a round in the side doing it. I think that's the important detail. He doesn't survive it because he shielded him. He didn't have to do that. He'd planned to be in that firing line himself. Afterwards, he slides a gun across the concrete and tells Jesse to do it. Says, "You want this?" And Jesse looks at the blood and hands it back and says, "Then do it yourself," and drives out through the gate laughing and screaming at the same time. And Walt walks into the lab and touches the equipment and looks at his own reflection in the side of a tank and goes down on the floor with the blue lights coming through the windows and Badfinger playing. So, punishment or gift? My honest position, and I'll only say it once, is that it's a gift, and I think Walt would agree. He dies on his own terms in a room he loves, having got the money to his son, having killed everyone who took it, having freed Jesse, and having never once seen the inside of a cell. That's a win. He designed it as a win. And I think the show gives it to him because taking it away would have been a smaller, more comfortable ending than he deserved. Small thing. The episode is called Felina, which is an anagram of finale, and it's also the woman in the Marty Robbins song playing on the car stereo in the first 3 minutes. The whole ending is signposted in the opening scene, and almost nobody notices on a first watch. One last thought before we get to the closing, and it's about the machine gun. People point at that boot rig as the least believable thing in the show, and I understand why. It's a bit of an action film in a series that mostly isn't one. But I'd argue it's the most in-character object Walter White ever builds. He doesn't hire anyone. He doesn't buy a solution. He works out the geometry of a car park he's never seen, mounts a weapon on a pivot so it sweeps a room he can't enter, and triggers it with a key fob so he can be on the floor when it happens. It's a chemistry teacher's answer to a problem. It's a demonstration set up in advance with the variables controlled. And the thing that kills him is that he got the maths very slightly wrong about his own body, which honestly is the most Walter White ending imaginable. Not caught, not outsmarted, just a rounding error in his own calculation in his favor right up until it wasn't. A couple of things from that last night that I didn't want to lose in the middle of all that. He sees Skylar first. He gets into a flat he has no business being in, stands in the corner and waits for her to notice him, and it should be threatening, and it isn't at all because he's finished. And he tells her where the boy is buried on a piece of paper, so she has something to trade with the prosecutors, which is the only genuinely useful thing he does for anybody that week. He also at some point walks into Gretchen and Elliot's house. They come home from a dinner party, the alarm's off, and Walter White is stood in their sitting room looking at family photographs. He gives them a hold-all containing just under 10 million pounds worth of cash and instructs them to give it to his son on his 18th birthday as a gift from them, because a gift from him would never get through. And when they hesitate, he calls in 2 hitmen with laser sights who are in fact Badger. And Skinny Pete stood in the garden with laser pointers they bought that afternoon for a few quid. I love that scene more than almost anything else in the finale. It's the last con he ever runs, and it costs £11.50. I've been thinking about why this show holds up to a 4th and 5th rewatch when a lot of others don't, and I think tonight has more or less answered it for me. Almost everybody in Breaking Bad gets the death that matches how they lived. The impatient man dies fast and pointlessly. The patient one is beaten by the only thing he refused to be patient about. The woman who never looked at what she was ordering is poisoned by the one habit she couldn't give up. The man who used a chain on somebody dies by it. The one who couldn't get a machine open gets closed by it. That doesn't happen, not out here. Out here it's mostly Hank in a hole and Mike by a river, and a boy on a dirt bike who waved at the wrong people. Bad things happen to people who were merely nearby, and there's no shape to it, and nobody writes it down afterwards. So a show that hands out proportionate endings is doing something we don't get anywhere else, and I suspect that's the real appeal. Not the crime, not the chemistry, not the hats. Just the deep and slightly embarrassing pleasure of watching a world where the books balance. And it's still honest about it, which is the trick. It gives you enough undeserved deaths to keep you from getting comfortable. It keeps reminding you that the tidiness is a story. There's something else in it too, I think, and it took me a while to work out what. Every person we've talked about tonight had a moment where they could have stopped. Gus could have let Hector die in that hospital bed. Walt could have taken the money in season 1. Lydia could have gone back to her office and her daughter and never rung anybody again. Todd could have not got out of the car. None of them do, and the show is very careful never to make any of those moments dramatic. They're all small, they're all a shrug and a decision made in about 4 seconds. That's the actual argument underneath all the explosions. Not that bad people get punished, but that nobody is ever more than one ordinary afternoon away from the version of themselves that gets punished. Which is a bleak thing to say, and the show says it very cheerfully. Anyway, that's the lot. I've got a couple of these I'd like to do properly at some point. There's a whole video in the prequel's ledger, which is a much stranger set of scales, mostly because so many of those people are still walking around at the end of it. And I'd like to do one on the deaths Breaking Bad never actually shows you, the ones that happen off-screen or in a line of dialogue, because there are more of them than you'd think, and some of them are quietly the worst things in the series. And I'd quite like to do a proper one on Mike at some point, because I've mentioned him 3 times tonight and given him about 90 seconds, and he deserves better than that from me. But those are for another evening. Wherever you are, whatever time it's got to. Thanks for keeping me company with this one. Sleep well.